Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout from the Hagley Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. And in the Hagley History Hangout, we like to bring to you some of the most innovative research being done out of the Hagley collections, especially by researchers who have received support from the Hagley Center for their work. And I'm being joined today by Kevin Bunch, one such researcher who in his day job is a writer and communications specialist at the International Joint Commission, which, in case you didn't know, is among the largest transnational water management projects in world history. But in his spare time, Kevin conducts research into the early history of video games and computers, for which he has received support from the Hagley Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society. And one of the things that Kevin is really interested in, and I hope we can talk to him about today, is the deeper stories of commercial failures, or some of those makers of video games that didn't make it, but can nevertheless teach us a lot about the history. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Should be a lot of fun.
Well, that's great. Well, why don't you start with your project? Could you tell us a little bit more about your research?
Yeah, so I'm interested in looking into RCA's history with video games and computers more broadly. So for those unaware, in 1977, RCA published a video game home console called the Studio 2. It was not a commercial success. That same year, they also put out a hobbyist computer called the Cosmac VIP that was slightly better received. In either case, they were both kind of just blips on the broader tapestry of video game history and the industry. But I found them very interesting because up until a few years ago, not a lot was really known about them, other than the fact that RCA put them out and they're not very good. And I figured there was more to the story than that, and turns out there's quite a bit.
Well, why video games? Why is that your angle on history?
So that's something I've been interested in since I was a kid, honestly. I remember going to our public library and there was this old book about video games from like 1982 or so. And I remember checking it out and reading it, and I'm like, wow, I've never heard of any of this stuff. And there was some like brief history portions of it too that was even more intriguing to me. So as soon as the internet came along, I started poking around with the folks who were already doing that kind of research, and eventually it just sort of escalated and I started doing it myself.
And that led you to the Hagley Library.
It did. So I'm originally from Michigan, but when I took the job at the IJC, I moved out to Maryland, which is significantly closer to Delaware. And I had heard from some other folks who were interested in RCA that the Hagley Library had gotten all of these documents from the old Sarnoff Library. And there was probably some interesting stuff in there. So a few months into living out here, made my way out there, and turns out, the first time I went out there, the library was closed because of an event. But the second time was very, very productive. And then I've made a few more trips since, culminating in the research grant that I got from you folks last year. So I got to spend a week out there, which was very informative.
And that's great. So you've been in the RCA collections then?
Yeah, in and out.
What document or series of sources have you found just the most exciting or unexpected?
So for me, I think that might be the materials on RCA's Arcade Machine project. Most of those were in the Billy Joe Call papers. There was a couple things about it in the Joe Weisbecker ones as well. But basically around 74, 75, they got the idea that, we have these 1801 microprocessors now. They they've been working on this for a few years and they should do something with it. Joe Weisbecker was really interested in video games, from before there were video games, basically.
Right.
So he really wanted to do like an arcade machine. So him and Billy Joe sort of worked on this as a project. And according to the documentation, they built, I think, 6 of them. And they had them set up in different areas. In your collection, you actually have photos that Joe Weisbecker took at an arcade in Pennsylvania. His daughter identified, what was going on in that for me, because she's a huge help. And yeah, so they did these location tests. Apparently, they did not go well. So they just sort of dropped it and moved to working on like the Studio 2 home system. But the arcade machine's really interesting because it has a lot of innovations that you didn't really see in 1975. Like it used a microprocessor, like the first arcade games that had those didn't debut until the end of 75. It also had like interchangeable games. So like you had your main game board that was where the microprocessor and all the hardware lived, and then you could swap out the actual game ROM file. I can't exactly tell based on the paperwork if it was like just a little daughter board or if it was a cartridge like you'd know it today. But either way, that's something that you really didn't see for years and years until after RCA was fiddling with this.
Right.
You folks also ended up having quite a few cassettes in your collection. And that's actually one of the first things that like drew my attention, was looking at the labels on these on your website. It's like, that one says Coin Arcade on it. I wonder. So I worked with your folks to get those digitized, and I worked with a former RCA programmer, Andy Modla, fellow out in Europe, Marcel van Tongeren, to get like emulation working for the arcade boards in the first place based on the schematics that are at Hagley, and we got those games working again, and one can conceivably go online and play them.
That's fantastic. And this is from cassettes of magnetic tape?
Yes, these were like data tapes that they used in the 1970s to record programs, which is also something fun that the RCA engineers were testing out. So before the arcade machine, they had Fred, which was it was Joe Weisbecker's prototype home computer, basically, that he built in his basement around 71. And he wanted to make that, something that more people could actually use. So once RCA, ran away from the computer business, he pitched this to the folks that he worked with. They're like, hey, we could do this. You could use it for games or industrial uses or whatever. They agreed to it as long as no one would call it a computer when discussing it with upper management, because it was apparently a very sensitive topic. Originally everything was on punch cards, but early on they developed a standard way to read and save data to cassette tapes. And so all sorts of cassettes in your collection and in the College of New Jersey's Sarnoff collection, those have all been digitized, and at least the ones that work still. And the contents have been decoded, and it's a lot of really cool, like, rich peeks into the early history of computing and games in general. It might be, I was gonna say, it might be one of the most robust histories for a company of its era.
Well, and it sounds like they were quite ahead of the curve technically. What was it that caused them to struggle commercially? Did the games lack appeal from the consumer perspective, or what other reason you might have found?
So according to the memos in the collection there, they sold approximately something like 53 to 64,000 units in 1977.
Mhm.
which, doesn't sound that bad, except when you take into account that its competitors each sold, around 200,000 units.
Hmm.
So that was Fairchild and Atari at the time.
I see.
So the games itself I played, there's 1977 lineups on all three of those, and they're all about, what you'd expect.
Hmm.
I don't think any of them are dramatically better than the others. But the Studio 2 had a few things working against it. First off, so the main marketing muscle for RCA was not behind this. That department did not pick it up, so it ended up going to the special products and distribution division, which that's the part of the company that would sell TV antennas and like accessories like that.
I see.
So that was a much smaller part of the company, and they had much less of a commercial footprint. So it already had that working against it. Management didn't seem to be super into it in the first place, which is probably why it ended up there. I think some of the other issues it had is that it's a black and white game, not a color one. I guess part of this was, according to the folks I've interviewed, Joe Weisbecker was not interested in color. He thought it was a gimmick. He didn't think a good game needed it. So he did not push hard for it until after Fairchild, put out their Channel F system, and it had full color, and everyone at RCA is like, well, shoot, we have to follow what they're doing. So then they ended up sort of playing catch up there, and it was a little bit of a mess. And I think the other big thing that hurt their chances was the FCC, because at the time the FCC was very stringent about getting approval for home game systems, and it didn't just trip up RCA; it tripped up a lot of other companies too.
Well, what sort of regulatory hurdles did they erect?
So it was around like the radio frequency emissions. So ostensibly radiation. They didn't know what was a safe level and how much would like impact the functioning of TV, so they just set the limits very, very high. And around 79, 1980, they lowered those dramatically, so it was easier for companies to meet it. But so RCA had planned to get the Studio 2 out before Christmas of 76. Functionally, it didn't start making it out into stores until February of 1977, and even then it didn't really get a full national rollout until around June, from what I can tell. You kind of see this with the other companies. Like Fairchild had planned a much bigger release for the Channel F, and that didn't make it out until like right after Thanksgiving in 76, and they barely had time to produce anything. So
and that's such contrast with today, where we think of video game companies as real behemoths of marketing and distribution.
Yeah, that was not so much the case. Like, RCA was a behemoth, but RCA had, a lot of other things going on at the time. So, no, but the only company that did well there was Atari, because they had Sears behind them, and Sears was a behemoth and, knew how the FCC worked. They were able to sort of grease the wheels there. No such luck for RCA.
And also connect directly with retail customers, which...
Yeah. RCA had their family stores, which they did sell, the Studio 2 through. But as far as I can tell, it was in other storefronts, but I don't think it had quite the same level of traction as the other companies did. It's a weird system in a few other ways too. Like, instead of having, any kind of actual audio capabilities, it just has a beeper, basically, like a piezo beeper. So you get a nice squelching sound whenever you're doing anything.
Is it at least a rhythmic squelching?
They try sometimes. And then instead of like a normal controller, it has these built-in keypads on the system itself, and that's how you control it, which makes sense when you remember that it came from sort of this computer background. And when you look at the design of the dedicated home systems that could only play like Pong or whatever, and those all had controls built into them.
Hmm.
But in a world where you're competing with the Channel F and the Atari VCS, which have these breakout controllers, it's a weird choice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it uses the 1802 processor, which is based off of, Fred, sort of the evolution of the 1801 that they had in arcade machines. And it's, it's fine, but it's not super fast compared to, the 6502 that Atari used, or the F8 that Fairchild used. So,
And would that limit the programmer, or does that affect the end user's experience?
It more affects the programmer.
Okay. Yeah.
It makes certain games less suitable for the system. I talked to Andy Modla about this, and he was telling me that the first game he tried to make was a little space shooting game where a second player flew UFOs around and shot at each other. And he's like, yeah, it didn't really work very well because the processor isn't super fast, so they kind of move pokily around the screen. He did a few other games that he felt worked a lot better, like blackjack and pinball. So the system was good for certain kinds of games. I just don't know that they would be particular kinds of games that people who were buying home games were into at the time, because again, up until fairly recently, video games at home were basically for kids, and a lot of these games were either educational games for kids, which at the time they thought would be fine, but everyone made that mistake, having a poor educational game, or they were for adults, and adults weren't buying these things quite in the same capacity. So I think that all worked against it. The people who did buy it seemed to like it well enough, like based on their information back that they sent in on the registration cards. Granted, that's probably a biased sample since they liked it enough to send back a registration card, but yeah, it ended up in February 78, RCA ended up killing the Studio 2. They halted their plans for the Studio 3 follow-up, which was going to have proper sound and color, based on documents at the library and contemporary reporting in sort of the trade periodicals. It looks like RCA licensed out the Studio 3 and all their Studio 2 stuff to a company in Hong Kong called Conic, and they ended up publishing it overseas, like not in the US, but in Europe and Australia and Asia. So it did still make it out, which is, that's something. They also killed the Studio 4 project, which is going to be like their next generation leap. And you have some documentation about that. We've gotten that working in emulators too, based on the technical specs and a couple of the schematics and the OS code, operating system, and that sort of thing. And actually, on this last visit to the library, I found the basic computer language interpreter for the Studio 4, and we were able to implement that into that emulator. Wow. So now one could conceivably bake their own Studio 4 programs.
Wow.
Or a machine that never came out.
I mean, this is a kind of digital archaeology.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really been fun and rewarding work so far. And there's still more to dig into. I did not make it through everything I'd hoped to last time I visited.
Are your emulators available online or to the public?
If you look up EMMA02, so that's EMMA02, it should bring up the website that you can download it from. It's got all the emulators for the various Fred, 1801, 1802 platforms that have been made over the years, and it includes a bunch of programs on there, so you can just load them up through that.
Great.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
There's still more to do, because on this last visit I found a bunch of programs that were type-in code,
Uh-huh.
So you have to like type in the stuff either on the emulator or the actual hardware.
Hmm.
And I have not done that yet because that is time consuming, but
Mm.
that's at least another dozen or so games and other such programs. So that'll be fun.
That's great. And what other plans do you have for the future of your project?
So my ultimate goal is to put all this together into a book.
Hmm.
I've already done a couple of videos on YouTube
Mhm.
on my YouTube channel, Atari Archive. And those are about RCA based on the research I pulled together from going to Hagley at those points in time. I've since found more since I did either of those videos. I also gave a talk at MagFest about this in 2019
Hmm.
alongside Florencia Pieri, who at the time was the curator of the Sarnoff collection at the College of New Jersey.
Mhm.
And that was also very well received, and you can find that on YouTube as well.
Well, that's great.
But yeah, I want to
Mhm.
do a book, so that's what I'm working on right now.
Mhm.
So that's why I keep digging through your archives. That's why I'm trying to track down as many surviving people who were associated with any of these projects as I can and interview them. I've already gotten through 6 or 7 people, just working on a next
Yeah.
batch and hopefully tracking down some more after that.
Yeah, oral history seems like a really great method for this project.
Yeah, because the documentation's a great primary source,
Mhm.
but there's going to be gaps, and it's nice to have people who can fill in those gaps.
Mhm.
Like nothing in the paperwork talks about how Joe Weisbecker didn't like color, and he didn't like to use a lot of memory, although you can kind of infer that based on his writing.
Mm.
But if you talk to the people who worked with him and on these projects, they're like, "Oh yeah, that was Joe. That's how he looked at things." Uh, and there's other things that didn't really make it in there. Like I talked to one fellow, Paul Russo, and he was telling me how the original Fred uh, only had 8 switches on it, and that's how you input programs or operated programs.
Mm.
And apparently it was very time consuming. So one of the first things he did on the project was build a hex keypad of like 16 keys so you could
Uh-huh.
type stuff in much, much quicker.
Mm.
And that's that's the surviving Fred unit that you can see up at TCNJ.
Mm.
But in your photo archives, there is a photo of the original Fred with its switches
Mm.
that would not have been recognized or identified until I'd gotten that bit of information from an oral history.
Right.
So it's very useful for identifying things that I have questions about in the archive.
I wonder whether you have, you might draw any implications for the present day from your research. A sort of a two-part question here, whether what you've observed about the evolution of the past of video games shed some light on the current state of video games, and also about digital preservation, about give it 50 or 100 years, successive generations of people doing the type of work you're doing. What could we do today to make their future work easier?
So I guess in your first question, that's a very good one. I'd say that I think it's very clear that success is not necessarily based on who got there first or who had the best hardware specs or whatever. It's part of it is definitely going to be based on whether or not it's got the the game company or whatever is supporting their software or hardware as well as they could be, because I think that was a big problem for RCA is yeah, the system was a little delayed and it was not it didn't exactly hold up to the competition super well, but yeah, it's a perfectly fine machine. It could have probably lasted on the market for a couple more years. But the company wasn't interested in it and it just got killed off. Fairchild, they were kind of interested in it, but they were also very burned from the many home appliance fads at the time, like CB radios or calculators or digital watches. And so they were very conservative with the Channel F and that in terms of like production numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And then they ran into problems in other parts of their market and ended up closing down anyway. But Atari supported the heck out of their system. They had, Warner Brothers owning the company, so they had money. And they basically just kept pushing their stuff out there until it really made a dent and became a real success. And I think you still kind of see that to an extent today, although I think for as far as the hardware manufacturers go, they definitely take different approaches to their markets. I think they're aiming for different niches. And that's something else that probably would have helped RCA a little bit better, is if they had tried targeting a different market than the other companies were. Like maybe they should have aimed more for adults and tried to get more games of that nature in there. Maybe they should have aimed more for arcade style games, even if the machine was not ideally suited for them. But, hindsight being what it is.
Well, the gift of the historian.
Yeah. As far as digital preservation goes, I think the most useful things that can be done now is, getting in touch with as many people as possible who were there at the time and are willing to discuss their role in it. Trying to get, materials digitized and put into physical archives like the Hagley. I know there's a few institutions that are doing that kind of work and making their materials available for researchers, which is fantastic. But it's kind of tricky because a lot of game history, like preservation that's been done so far, has essentially been piracy, because the industry has not really cared about it much up to until fairly recently. So, it's people finding old unreleased materials and, pulling the data out and putting that online, or it's people who dumpster dove for documentation that the companies didn't keep because they were closing up or moving locations. It's that sort of thing. And that's where a lot of this stuff has come from. But, I don't know that that's necessarily sustainable in the long term. It would be nice if the industry in general would, take a more mindful approach to how they preserve things. But I think those are the keys. We want to have documentation if at all possible. I understand it's not always possible. We want to have people who can put that in context. That's part of why I want to do this book, is that I want to have that record available to people in the future, like have some foundational research done into RCA here. So maybe in 100 years, they might have more material than I did at the time, or maybe they won't, but they can at least look at what I've put together and say, okay, well, here's what we know about RCA. This guy put it all together. We can infer from there, and if we can access any of the actual documentation, we can. That's good. So,
and that's the magic of research.
Yeah, and it's worked out elsewhere. Like, I haven't just been working on RCA. I've worked on some other companies as well, and like Bally, like the company behind the Bally health clubs. Back in the 70s, they owned video game company Midway, and they had a home game system, and it was unsuccessful. Barely anyone bought it. They sold it off to another company that struggled on its own and then went out of business in '83. But the people who really were into that system saved so much of the documentation. They saved a lot of like user programs. And those are all online now. And when I'm doing my research, I can refer back to these things that people saved, 10 years ago. Probably not thinking much of it other than like, oh, it'll be cool to have these online. And, eventually into a physical archive. But so Yeah,
And
you never know.
yeah, and it could, because as time passes, new significance becomes evident.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like in the 90s or early 2000s, I don't know anyone would have looked at these Bally user programs that were being done and sold through Basic as anything more than a curiosity. But you look at it today, it's like, oh, well, was the early days of indie video games.
Oh, sure.
These were early indie developers, just figuring out their machines and selling amongst each other.
Mm,
That's super cool.
absolutely. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for speaking with me today and sharing your project.
Thank you. I look forward to digging into your archives more and letting you know when I have a finished book on this.
I look forward to it. And to the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts or more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, visit us online at hagley.org. That's hagley.org. And don't be a stranger.